Well, today it's a very chastened Lefty Louis who wants to give you all of you, his 0.1% analysis of what happened in the elections. I think on my side, it's going to be a little bit different than what a lot of people say. The first thing, predictably enough, was said was, well, what did the Democrats do that was wrong? And it's very interesting because among the people who have the largest following, for example, there's Cenk Uygur. And he was almost triumphant for somebody who claims to be on the left, saying, yeah, the Democratic Party is corrupt. They have all those donors, like the Republicans didn't have donors. Like, hey, Cenk, you ever heard of Elon Musk? I don't think it made a damn bit of difference to voters because they chose the other party that had plenty of donors as well. I don't think that people are thinking, well, Republicans have donors, but at least they're open about it. But the Democrats, have these dirty donors. No, I think that's rubbish. Now, one of the areas where clearly the Republicans beat the Democrats, or Trump beat Harris, was on the question of immigration. And why? Because fear is an excellent injection into a political campaign. Because what happened was, it was the old rule of divide and conquer. They put fear not only in native people's eyes, but in immigrants' eyes, like immigrants who had come in legally. When Trump kept saying, there are these evil people coming in, would say also, yeah, well, we came in legally, so we don't want any of these illegals coming in. And they even showed pictures of people who are waiting to be tested, to be admitted, possibly, saying, yeah, we don't want any of these other bad people to come in. So I think this was a traditional, classic view that fear outplays more positive things. Another thing that I found interesting was, under Joe Biden, we got back to full employment, which had not been the case in the United States for decades. But, of course, there was the inflation. Well, the poll showed that Americans prefer some unemployment to high inflation, which is lovely. It's very community-minded. Let the poorest of our society get unemployed so that we don't have to suffer inflation. But that's another story. But it's very interesting take on this. Then there was one of the brighter bulbs who said, well, the Democrats gave the impression that they were persecuting Trump. Persecuting Trump! No human being in the history of the United States has gotten away with more than Trump got. But they said that they were persecuting Trump. This is absolutely beyond me. This is also total garbage. Now, here's another thing. We say that the working class people revolted. And here, I'm going to address you again, Bernie. Bernie, I love you, and God, I would love to canvass for you 10 times harder than I did for Kamala. But I'm sorry, Bernie, you got it wrong. The first thing Bernie said was, well, the Democrats deserted the working class, so the working class deserted the Democrats. Now, I have a question here, which is that 48% of people voted for Kamala Harris. Now, that 48% can't be composed solely of college graduates, educated people, people in show business. In other words, what I'm saying is there were plenty of work, and I met some in Pennsylvania when I was canvassing. There are plenty of working class people who knew that Trump for exactly the crook and the fascist that he is. So the question is, why did some people vote for Trump, some working class, and others did not? And I think it goes back to something personal in life. When different people have the same experience, they have different reactions. So, for example, if I am your father and I beat you up, a minority of you will say, well, I was beaten up, so I never hope to touch my child with even a finger. But a majority of people, when they're beaten up like that, can get pretty hardened to the idea of beating up on others. So here's the thing. So here were Democrat voters also just as troubled by inflation as the working class that shifted over to the Republicans. So why didn't they shift over to Trump? And I think that what you have really is two different mentalities. So I'm going to come back to Bernie. A lot of people said, in the sort of post-mortem view of the Democrats didn't go far left enough. Kamala really sort of abandoned, the working class. She in the beginning she talked like a populist, but in the end she abandoned the working class. Well, Bernie, I admire you very much. But let's face it, when you ran in a primary in 2016, you did surprisingly well. You did fire up people, and people who like you very much. And I, among them, think that you put your voice right on the money. But eventually, Hillary did outpoll you, and that's within the Democrats. And then in 2020, you started out with a big lead over Joe Biden. And then came Tuesday with 11 different states. And frankly, I love you, but you got shellacked. So you've twice been beaten within the Democratic Party. And I think there's some explanation for this. So again, one has to make the distinction. Bernie fired up people in a way that centrist Democrats, with all their cowardice, and it is cowardice, did not. But the fact of the matter is he still fired up a minority of people. Now, the other interesting thing is that I think that the other interesting thing is several polls that were taken where Americans said that Trump was not extreme. Majority of Americans did not see him as too extreme or too conservative. Majority of Americans thought that Kamala Harris, who is a centrist, was too far to the left. And I think that says more than all the analyses about, the Democrats being cowards, and they are, but not going far enough left that somehow a Bernie would have inspired people. Do not forget as well the myth that, Trump voters, that Bernie voters went over to Trump. That is true. 12% of Bernie voters went over to Trump. That's not a hell of a lot. And it signifies to me, again, different folks, different strokes. So some people, went over to Trump. Some stayed with Bernie. But the point is that again, people in difficulty react in different ways. And some, seeing immediate situation of inflation and also their fear of immigration, passed over to Trump. And others, almost as numerous, did not. I think basically what has to be said is, there's one other thing I'd like to point out too, and that is that I am very, very disturbed at the lack of even the pundits talking about democracy. There seemed to be very little concern, except among a minority of Democrats, or even a majority of Democrats, but a minority of voters. Very, very little concern about the fact that, well, should we go over this again? Trump calling the governor of Georgia and asking him to come up with 11,780 votes. I mean, that's pretty brazen. The January 6th, that didn't seem to move the needle. And all the other charges against Trump and all of his foul language, and none of this seemed to move the needle. Now, I believe very strongly that blacks and Latinos should not be taken for granted. They have the same right to vote conservative as whites. I mean, that's what the civil rights is about. But I do think it's strange. There was less movement within the black community. Do think it's strange how violent the swing was in the Latino community, because Trump has repeatedly insulted Latinos. And he's talked about these bad Mexicans coming in. And I just, again, there are things I do not understand. And that is one of them. How people can take those insults and just say, well, I'm going to go for him anyway. Now, there was also, I do think that Harris made one mistake, but I don't think that would have really changed the electoral results. and that was the fact that she didn't break with Biden on the question of the Middle East. I thought that was disastrous. She gave no reassurance to Muslim voters, particularly in Michigan, where many are centered, that she was going to ask for an arms embargo or really push Israel to stop. But on the other hand, I would have to say to my Muslim friends, think a moment about Trump, because Trump said that it was fine for Israel to wipe out the Palestinians, as far as he's concerned, because he is a cold-blooded psychopath. But people didn't pay any attention to that. And they're going to find now, boy, are they going to find now, some of them are going to regret what they did. So, in sum, I want to say that I don't think that, people say never blame the voters, never blame the electorate. The electorate is always right. Well, at the risk of being deemed snobby or aristocratic, which I am not, I do think that voters have a responsibility. And I do think that many, many Americans who voted for Trump they're not stupid people, they're not bad people, but they are pig ignorant. And I think that I just think that there are some things that are too hard to believe. Now, the whole thing about, now they're saying, well, Kamala concentrated too much on women and not enough on men. This whole business of men, particularly white men, being left out, I think what bothers me is that every time there is a movement for equality, whether it's equality of Black or Native American or Latino with whites or women with men, it seems like there's a reaction where a lot of people say, well, I'm lost. Everybody's forgotten me. It's like they can't tolerate the idea that making women equal doesn't mean making men inferior. It just means making women equal. And the same thing about, the demographics of the country are changing and I feel lost, it's not the country I used to know. Well, hell, this country was made up of immigrants, constant waves of immigrants. So what difference does it make if eventually the country becomes majority non-white? And so I have to ask some of you, why do you say that you feel left out? Why is it that when there are movements like Black Lives Matter and this sort of thing, that for many of you, you feel threatened? And I can only say that, I have to wonder about you. And the other thing that I would like to say is that, and this is going all over the world, and I'm afraid of it coming to Canada within the next year, that is the right-wing swing all over the world. It was shown that year 2024, almost all incumbent governments got the boot, or they lost substantially, like Modi in India, who just has to now cling on by working with other parties. Of course, that wasn't entirely true. Left continuation in Mexico and other places in Latin America, for example. But yes, it is true that there is this wave. Well, again, I believe in democracy, and I have to accept, like anybody else, initially the electoral results. But let us not forget, Trump talked about the immigrants poisoning the blood of this country. That is Hitler, pure and simple. And also somebody else who looks deliberately made a video because he looks like what you would think is a Trumper, the way he looks facially and with his Southern accent, who in fact was just the opposite. And he said, look, is the fact that price of gas is too high that it would make you feel that you have to vote for a fascist demagogue? And I would have to say, too, and I know that I have to say to you, as I've said before, I am a privileged person, and so it's easier for me to stand back. But I do have to say that I think that everybody from every income has at least a minimal responsibility to support the idea of democracy and peaceful transitions of power, and not when you have a situation like Haitian immigrants working hard in Ohio, and that's overshadowed by cats and dogs being eaten, and people still it still didn't move the needle. And so I think this, fundamentally, the United States is a conservative country. And I think that's a lot of the reason of what happened. We have our liberal moments historically. In fact, during the 1920s, we were always voting very right-wing Republicans. Then when the Depression came, yes, the country moved to the left. And all sorts of progressive legislation was initiated. But it's also interesting that in the 1930s, people faced worse economic conditions than what they have today. And yet they didn't, the fascist crackpots who ran for president just were buried under an avalanche of votes for Roosevelt. So I think that I don't think that I could ever trust American people again in saying that American people, support democracy. I think it's very, very clear. Maybe my son is right. Maybe my son said, Pop, when people are struggling with grocery prices, democracy takes second place. And maybe that is the case. And the other thing is, if you look at what Trump has started to do immediately, he's riding high and he's starting to fulfill his promises given, promises kept. He's going to turf out 11 million immigrants. And when some people said, he can't do that because the price is too high, he said there's no such thing as a high price for doing that. And he's also making moves that indicate that he's going to try to make an authoritarian society. And I think that, I think there are only two things. I for one will never give up. I don't give up, but I do say this, that I don't think that anything that the Democrats do, and that means even if the party moved to the position that I like, which would be a left-wing social democratic party, I'm not sure that that would pass the test. I think that the only thing that can save the United States, and I'm sorry to say this, is when Trump and company start fucking up. So there are two possibilities. One, because there's an Australian commentator who said that this is going to be the last free election in the United States. And I have to say, I'm very afraid of this. But if this does not happen, the only remedy will be, and I'm not saying it looking down on them, but when people who voted for Trump start to get politically, in policy, their asses kicked. And then maybe, sanity will return to the good old USA.